It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a break from the chaos of city life. Sarah and her fiancé John decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. It was a quaint little cabin, nestled in a dense forest, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. Perfect for relaxation, or so they thought. The drive to the cabin took hours, the road narrowing until it became a single dirt path. The further they went, the more isolated it felt. No phone signal, no neighbors, just the two of them. The cabin looked rustic and old, but cozy. Sarah noticed the thick forest surrounding it, and a strange uneasiness crept into her mind. She brushed it off, blaming the eerie silence. Once inside, John lit the fireplace while Sarah explored the cabin. It was small, with creaky wooden floors and old furniture. There was something unsettling about it, though. The air felt thick, as if the walls were holding secrets. In the corner of the living room stood a large mirror, covered with a dusty white cloth. "John, come look at this," Sarah called. John came over and pulled the cloth off the mirror, revealing an antique, full-length mirror with an ornate frame. There was something odd about it, though. The glass seemed darker, almost as if it was stained. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine, but John shrugged. "It's just a mirror, probably really old," he said, putting the cloth back over it. As night fell, the forest around them became darker and more ominous. The wind howled, making the trees sway violently. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind slammed against it. Despite the cozy fire, Sarah couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that gnawed at her. They sat down to have dinner, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave Sarah. She glanced out the window several times, convinced she saw movement in the trees. But every time she looked, there was nothing, just darkness and shadows. After dinner, they decided to head to bed. The bedroom was small, with only a bed and an old dresser. The mirror from the living room haunted Sarah's thoughts, and for some reason, she couldn't stop thinking about it. "John, I have a weird feeling about that mirror. Do you think we should cover it again?" she asked as they climbed into bed. John laughed softly. "You're just freaked out because we're in the middle of nowhere. It's fine." But as they lay there in the dark, the wind howling outside, Sarah couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, feeling uneasy. Then, in the silence between the gusts of wind, she heard something. A faint, scratching noise. "John, do you hear that?" she whispered, nudging him. He groaned and rolled over. "It's probably just the wind." But the sound grew louder. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from inside the cabin. Sarah sat up, heart pounding in her chest. The scratching was now accompanied by soft thuds, like something, or someone, was moving around downstairs. "I'm checking it out," Sarah said, slipping out of bed. John sighed but followed her. They crept down the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. The scratching stopped as soon as they reached the bottom. The cabin was silent again, but the air felt even heavier, thick with an unseen presence. Then Sarah saw it, the mirror. The cloth had been pulled off, and there, in the reflection, was something standing behind them. A tall, shadowy figure. Sarah screamed, spinning around, but nothing was there. John quickly grabbed her arm. "It's just your imagination. Let's go back to bed." But Sarah couldn't shake what she saw. They covered the mirror again and reluctantly went back upstairs. The night dragged on, with Sarah unable to sleep. She kept hearing faint whispers, voices she couldn't understand, and footsteps pacing around downstairs. Just as she started to drift off, there was a loud bang. She shot out of bed, her heart racing. John was already awake, wide-eyed. The banging continued, like someone or something was pounding on the front door. It was frantic, desperate. John grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs. Sarah followed closely, gripping his arm. The banging stopped as soon as they reached the door. John hesitated, then slowly opened it. No one was there, just the cold, dark forest staring back at them. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew the door wide open and Sarah let out a gasp. The mirror. The cloth had been ripped off again, and this time the reflection was different. The shadowy figure was closer, much closer. John slammed the door shut, his face pale. "We need to leave. Now." They quickly grabbed their things, but as they headed for the door, the lights flickered and went out. The cabin plunged into darkness and the air grew colder. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she saw something moving in the shadows. The figure was no longer in the mirror. It was in the room with them. "John, it's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. John swung the flashlight around, but the beam of light only caught fleeting glimpses of the dark figure. It was moving, shifting, always just out of reach. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. The cabin felt alive, the walls closing in, the air suffocating. "Help us!" Sarah screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. Then the figure stepped into the beam of light. It was tall, with long, twisted limbs and hollow, glowing eyes. Its face was a grotesque mask of darkness and pain, with a gaping mouth that seemed to suck the air from the room. John backed up, his hand shaking as he held the flashlight. "Stay back!" he yelled, but his voice cracked with fear. The figure moved closer, its hollow eyes fixed on them. Sarah felt her legs go numb, her body frozen in terror. Then the figure whispered. It was a low, guttural sound like wind howling through the trees. "Leave, or join us." Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed John's arm and bolted for the door. They yanked it open and stumbled outside, the cold air hitting them like a wall. They ran, not daring to look back, not stopping until they were far from the cabin. Breathless and terrified, they stopped in a small clearing. The cabin was barely visible in the distance, but Sarah could still feel its presence, watching them. "We have to go back for the car," John said, his voice shaky. But Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, we can't go back. Not ever." As they stood there trying to catch their breath, Sarah glanced over her shoulder. And there, standing at the edge of the trees, was the figure, watching, waiting. They ran again, this time without stopping. They didn't look back, not until they were far, far away from the cabin. But even then, Sarah knew, they would never truly escape.